Welcome to our Introduction to Personality Theory course, and we continue discussing cognitive experiential domain. In last lectures, we tried to analyze the connection between different cognitive processes, emotions and intelligence, and personality characteristics. In this lecture, we will focus on the concept of self. So, our plan for this lecture is to discuss what is self, actually, what is descriptive component of self, what is evaluative component of self, and what is social component of self, and then we will come to logical conclusion. So let's dive in. What is self? Actually, it's a pretty good question, and it's very hard to provide you with one good comprehensive definition, because what is self is a subject for debate in psychology, and different psychologists from different theoretical perspectives answer this question differently. But still, we need to try to navigate in this complicated topic, so that's why we will start with the definition provided by American Psychological Association dictionary. So this definition is quite long, so let's analyze it carefully. Self-concept is one's description and evaluation of oneself, including psychological and physical characteristics, qualities, skills, roles, and so forth. Self-concepts contribute to the individual's sense of identity over time. The conscious representation of self-concept is independent in part on non-conscious schematization of the self. Although self-concepts are usually available to some degree to the consciousness, they may be inhibited from representation, yet still influence judgment, mood, and behavioral patterns. So what is important in this definition? First, it's our description and evaluation of ourselves. So our view on ourselves, our opinion on ourselves, including all our characteristics, not only psychological, but also physical characteristics, for example, height, weight, appearance, and so on. So what is interesting is that not all parts of self-concepts are conscious and available to consciousness. So some parts are operating on unconscious level, which is important because they still can influence our judgment, mood, and behavioral patterns. So we might get upset and make certain decisions based on our self-concept, which we not always fully reflect. And yet it still influences our life. So this is kind of tricky. So all self-concepts we have different level of self-complexity. It's the number of separated, unrelated aspects of the self-concept. So when you think about yourself, how many different, separate characteristics you consider at the same time. So self-concept in this sense can be simple, being made up of just few large categories. So for example, how you think about yourself in a job setting and how you think about yourself in family setting. And that's all, two big characteristics, and you don't perceive yourself outside those two big life situations. So it will create a simple self-concept because it's based only on two or like three, four separate unrelated aspects. On the other hand, self-concept can be multifaceted and complex if you include more possible areas, right? So for example, how I think about myself in relationships, romantic relationships, how I think about myself in a family, how I think about myself regarding my job place, what hobbies I have, how I perceive myself in relationships with my friends, and so on. So people who have more complex self-concepts are basically buffered from many hardships of life, because even if you fail in one area of your life, for example, you somewhat failed at work, you still understand that it's only a tiny fraction of who you are, and it doesn't necessarily mean a catastrophe in other areas of your life. So which is good. On the other hand, if you have simple self-concept with only like 2, 3 areas, even a small failure in one area can endanger your whole self, and it would be very stressful. So people with more multifaceted self-concepts have certain advantage in overcoming different life difficulties and obstacles. So, but concept and self is a very, very broad categories. So not surprisingly, they have different aspects, as we discussed at the beginning of this video: descriptive and evaluative and social components. So we need to discuss it one by one. But first, we need to understand how we actually can measure self-concept. It's self is a reality which is accessible to you personally, in terms of like access to your inner world. But how we can actually measure, do other people have self and self-concept? One of the very smart and clever ideas was the invention of the mirror recognition test. So basically, psychologists study the reaction of a person or animal based on how they recognize themselves into the mirror. So psychologists put a small mark on the face or head, which you cannot see without mirror. So for example, on the picture, you see a small boy with a dot on his nose. Obviously, this boy cannot see it without mirror, right? Because it's just impossible, physiologically speaking. Then participants, in this case, a small boy, placed in front of the mirror, and psychologists try to observe, does this person or animal try to remove this mark or dot from their body, or they do not react at all. So if they try to remove it, it means that they recognize themselves into the mirror, and that means that they pass this mirror recognition test, which is a basic test for the most simple aspect of having self-concept. Of course, not only people can pass this test, which is interesting. Who can pass this test? All the great apes, so including chimpanzees bonobo, gorillas, orangutans, and people. Asian elephants, not African. Bottlenose dolphins, one specific species of dolphins. Orcas, and one species of magpie. It's a bird represented on the picture, a relative of crow. So they're also very smart and can pass this mirror recognition test. So we're not the only species who can pass it. Though, of course, and obviously, self-concept of people is much more complicated and nuanced compared to self-concept of animals, because their mind just operates very differently from mind of people. Speaking about ontogenesis, or life-going development of self-concept, so we're coming through different stages. Usually, children start to pass this mirror recognition test only around 1.5 years old, so 18 months old. Before that, the vast majority of children do not recognize themselves into the mirror. So after that, they form the most simple self-concept, which starts to develop. Usually, before passing this mirror recognition test, children are not able to use personal pronouns, I, me, and mine. They often refer to themselves as a third person, or they use their name. the same way as their parents or caregivers address them. And only after 1.5 years old, sometimes 2 years old, they start to refer to themselves using personal pronouns, which is interesting. So children need to be about 2 years old before they start to recognize themselves on photos and pictures. So if you will show a picture with other people and will ask your child, for example, to find themselves, usually children able to complete this task only after they hit 2 years old. And again, on average, because there are some individual differences, some children do it a bit faster, some children do it a bit later. So after that, children starting to grow up slowly but steadily, and they start to compare themselves with other people. Usually it happens around 5-6 years old, when children in vast majority of countries start either kindergarten or schooling. So in schooling and kindergarten, children usually collaborate and interact with other children of their age, their peers. And obviously, they start to compare their own skills and knowledge and appearance and different aspects of themselves with other children. And they observe differences. For example, I can do that and other children cannot do that. Or I cannot do that and all other children can. For example, I cannot ride a bike, but all other children in my class, in school class, already can ride a bike. Oh, wow. Right? So children start to compare themselves with other children. And this process is important for forming self-concept because we understand ourselves in comparison to others. And that's the way how we form and internalize our self-concept in the first place. So during this time, children also learn that they can actually lie to other people. So they cannot not only tell the truth, but they can lie or keep secrets, so hide the truth. And actually, it creates more possible combinations, how they can present themselves and what they can think about themselves. So including forming so-called private self-concept. Private self-concept is attributes of yourself, characteristics of yourself, which you do not want to present to other people. You just know it about yourself, but not necessarily share with other people. It's something like super personal. It may be some of your views or fears or something which you consider inappropriate for some reason. So all people have this private self-concept, and it starts forming around 5-6 years old when children get an ability to lie and hide the truth. Because actually lying and hiding the truth requires a lot of self-control and developed mind operations, because to lie, you need to understand what other people might think about the situation and yourself, change it, say it and stick to this version, not to be caught on lying. So actually, intellectually speaking, lying is very advanced mental operation, and children only get this, only start to do that only around 5-6 years old. Before that, their brain is just immature to do that properly. So that is quite an interesting fact. So in adolescence, self-concept changes drastically because of life changes. So teenagers already have more interactions with the world. So while children 5-6 years old or even 10 usually communicate only with their parents and school teacher and their classmates, teenagers start to develop a more broad system of connections. Teenagers also experience a lot of body change connected with puberty. And finally, they get much more knowledge about the world and themselves to this age. just due to educational life experience, which results in significant changes in the self-concept. So usually teenagers start to describe themselves using a bit more abstract psychological categories compared to children. So, for example, teenagers tend to emphasize interpersonal characteristics, such as typical mood states, ideologies, and opinions and beliefs. I'm a moody person, I'm an atheist, I'm a liberal, right? So also teenagers obviously form certain beliefs and views in terms of politics, right? That can identify themselves through that, or even some philosophical concepts, like saying that I'm, for example, adaptive stoicism and so on. Right, so though it's still a bit more superficial compared to adult people with more life experience, but it's an important milestone on the way to forming even more developed self-concept. And what is important for teenagers, they get an ability to take different perspectives. So actually, it's intellectually very hard task to get the perspective of other people and try to put yourself on their place and try to perceive situation and evaluate situations not based on your personal standards, but based on standards of other people. And this perspective taking ability actually helps to develop self-concept and make it even more multifaceted and complicated. Speaking about self-concept in general and self-concept in adults, there is a difference between ideal and odd self. So this division was described by psychologist Tori Higgins in 80s and late 90s. So he introduced a division between ideal self, is like what you want to be, and odd self, your understanding what other people want you to be, right? And it's often different, right? So, for example, you might want to be a YouTube blogger and you perceive yourself, like ideal self, as having like developed YouTube channel with millions of subscribers and proper monetization, but your parents and your family perceive you as a doctor or a lawyer or engineer, and they completely do not want to see you as like a YouTuber, right? And you see, and you start to mention difference how I want to be and whom I want to be and what other people demand from me, right? And it's the difference between ideal and odd self. So in real life, we never can be perfect and ideal as we want to be. And we also cannot completely ignore what other people demand from us and expect from us. We live in a world which is full of responsibilities and duties. And so we cannot do only what we want. We also need to do what we need to do, we must to do. So all the people struggle to find this balance between real self, ideal self, and odd self. And sometimes it can create conflicts and real dramas of adult life. So the odd self usually built on what people take as their responsibilities and commitments to others. For example, your job place, right? When you work, you take some responsibilities and commitment to other people. It's a part of like labor and being a working person, right? You also might have responsibilities to your family members or your community or your religious group, right? And it might be important, but it not only what you want it to be and not only what you want to do. So the ideal self is built on our desires and goals and our understanding what we want to achieve in future, what we want to become. So Higgins refers to the odd and ideal self as so-called self-guides. So basically it's standards which we use to organize information and motivate ourselves, right? So I can have different self-guides based on what I prefer, the odd self or ideal self. So it creates different guides. So the ideal self guides us to focus our attention on our achievement and goal accomplishments, right? I want something, I set certain goals, I move towards them, and I achieve them, right? And it's so-called promotion focus. So I can be focused on promotion and getting more achievements and achieving goals and advance toward my ideal self, choosing this path. But alternatively, there is a prevention focus. It is motivated by the odd self-guide, shifting our attention to avoiding harm and seeking safety, right? Usually when we take responsibilities and commitments, so we don't want to harm other people. We want to do what we are obliged to do. And we seek safety that, yes, I performed all my duties quite well. I did a good job. I did everything what I promised to other people, and thus find safety, right? So it's different. Prevention focus and promotion focus, very different guides to what you and when and how you should do different things. So in this sense, achieving your personal goals associated with this promotion focus results in pleasure, right? You feel satisfaction. Yeah, I did it. Good job. Finally, I achieved this. And prevention focus and realization of its goals associated with relief. I made I made everything I promised. Now I feel relieved that I didn't fail anyone, right? So relief and satisfaction and pleasure, kind of very different motivators, right? So you can see what is more strong in yourself, promotion focus or prevention focus. And I think it would be also connected with your culture, because obviously people from individualistic cultures would be having more developed promotion focus, while people from collectivistic cultures obviously would be more guided by prevention focus, right? So in this sense, yes, there are individual differences, but I think they're also culturally specific. So this is how it works. Speaking about evaluative component of self, so descriptive component is a self-concept, evaluative component is self-esteem. We all know these words, but what is the definition of the self-esteem? So self-esteem is a degree to which the qualities and characteristics contained in one's self-concept are perceived to be positive, right? So you take your self-concept, your knowledge of yourself, and you evaluated different aspects of your self-concept as positive or negative, right? We always have complicated self-esteem. So it might reflect your physical characteristics, view on your accomplishments and achievements, your values, perceived success of your life and how actually you fulfill your goals and dreams. Do you live according to your values or not? And other characteristics, including our interaction with other people and so on. So our self-esteem might be as complex as our self-concept, right? Because you evaluate yourself based on different facets of your self-concept. So average levels of self-esteem usually fluctuate across the lifespan, which is like totally normal. And usually it happens in predictable ways. For example, adolescents, like teenagers, often have lower self-esteem compared to adult people because they didn't get enough life experience and didn't achieve much, so they inexperienced. They face many situations for the first time. Because of that, they do not feel that confident as people in their midlife who already faced many challenges, overcame some of them, sorry, and already got enough experience to evaluate themselves. So usually your self-esteem increases after positive life events and successes. When something good happens, your self-esteem rises. and your self-esteem decreases after negative life events. So it's quite typical. So, for example, people who lose their job place experience decrease in their self-esteem. People who got promoted on their job place got increase in self-esteem. It's actually very obvious, but it's important because those life events also might be not connected with your personal achievements. It may be just luck. For example, you won in the lottery, but it still will affect your self-esteem, and you will experience a boost of self-esteem even if you got lucky, and you will experience decrease in self-esteem even if something bad happened to you just because of bad luck, right? So, for example, I don't know, you got sick, you got COVID because someone didn't wear the mask. It's not your fault, right? But you will probably still experience small decrease in your self-esteem. So it fluctuates during the lifespan based on situations you encounter, and it also changes in certain patterns, depends on your age. So there are a lot of myths about self-esteem, and I think it would be nice to discuss them. So the most popular myths. So myth number one, high self-esteem is correlated with all manner of positive characteristics, such as being physically attractive, smart, kind, generous, and so on. Actually, it's not true, because individuals with high self-esteem may have an inflated or unrealistic view of themselves, right? High self-esteem doesn't necessarily mean that it's like earned, all right? So actually, other people might have very different opinion on how generous and kind you are, which might not coincide with your opinion of yourself. And in this sense, your self-esteem is relatively independent from characteristics you evaluate and highly subjective. So it might be completely inaccurate, and often it is the case. So myth number two, self-esteem promotes success in school. For a long period of time, it actually was a common misconception about self-esteem, and many school systems included a lot of rewards for children without any regard to their performance, right? So you get like golden stars and points and appraisal without doing any homework or do not showing any skills and knowledge. Actually, there is no empirical evidence to support that idea that if you have high self-esteem, you have better academic success. Actually, like artificially boosting self-esteem through unconditional praise may actually lower performance at school, which is interesting. So usually rewarding in academic activities should be connected with performance, or it creates a lot of delusion and actually lowers performance. So the same myth was connected with like job settings, that high self-esteem promotes success at the job place. And actually correlation are quite modest. And what is super interesting, if we ask to evaluate your performance, not you personally, but people who work with you, this correlation drops to zero. So actually, there is no connection between how you personally evaluate your performance at job place and how actually other people perceive your impact and your performance. I find this super fascinating fact. So many people have low self-esteem, and it's undeserved low self-esteem. So they actually performing better than they think. But a lot of people have undeserved high self-esteem. So they think they're like super good professionals, but it's actually not true. So it only shows that self-esteem is highly subjective and not always correlated with real success, performance, and anything which is related to reality. Myth number four, high self-esteem makes a person likable and popular. So if you like super self-confident and you have super high self-esteem, other people start to like you as well. Actually, it's also not true. So people who think that they are like super desirable, attractive, good looking, and so on, start conversations first. This is scientific regularity, which we found. So people who are like super self-confident usually start speaking with strangers first, and it helps them to find some new acquaintances, but it's not associated with being more likable. So you become more initiative, but you do not become more popular and likable because of high self-esteem. And it's actually a huge difference, which is also quite interesting. So myth number 5, low self-esteem puts a person at risk for drug and alcohol abuse and also premature sexual activity. So there were some theories that teenagers with lower self-esteem involved in the premature sexual activity, in activities very early to boost their self-esteem, and they also take more drugs and alcohol. But actually, it's not the case. So basically, it's not connected to self-esteem, it's connected to other factors. So why people actually take drugs, abuse alcohol, and involve in premature sexual activities is much more complicated, but it's not connected with self-esteem. At least we don't have any direct and firm evidence that high self-esteem can protect people from all those dangerous and risky behaviors. And finally, myth number 6, only low self-esteem people are aggressive. So psychologists studied bullying, for example, at schools, and initial hypothesis was that the bullies are experiencing low self-esteem, and that's why they're more aggressive, not confident enough in themselves, and they're trying to display this feeling of inadequacy with aggression toward other people. But actually, research shows that actually no. And if high self-esteem leads to aggression only if it's a part of narcissistic personality disorder. So only in this case it's associated with aggression, and as you can see, it's high self-esteem, not low self-esteem. So actually research on bullies showed that they don't have low self-esteem. Often they have actually high self-esteem, and they're much more confident, and this confidence gives them this internal feeling that they can perform violent actions toward other people. So actually there is no connection between low self-esteem and aggressive behavior, or at least this connection is like super indirect, which is also, I find it's quite unexpected and surprising. So the basic like conclusion on that. So what we actually know about self-esteem and its impact on our life. So people with high self-esteem perform better in group activities. That is fact. So if you give an assignment which is connected with group activities, doesn't matter, is it like academic setting or job setting, people with higher self-esteem would perform a bit better. And high self-esteem is related to social confidence and taking the initiative in making new friends. So people with high self-esteem start conversation with strangers first, and they try to make more connections because they're more confident. It's what we know. On the other hand, having low self-esteem and poor self-image is a risk factor for developing eating disorders, not alcohol and drug abuse, but eating disorders, for example, bulimia. And low self-esteem is related to depression. It is true. So this is a correlation which is confirmed, right? So low self-esteem actually one of the symptoms of depression. So this correlation shouldn't be surprising. Shouldn't be surprising. Self-esteem varies in different people, and in people in different situations. So you also have different periods of your life with different self-esteem. So Michael Kernis believes that self-esteem variability is high in some people. So some people experience like those roller coasters in their self-esteem because of several factors, right? Some people have very firm self-esteem, which doesn't change much even after different life events, positive and negative. But some people experience this roller coaster, like their self-esteem fluctuates with a huge range. So why it might happen? According to Michael Kernis, people with high self-esteem variability have an enhanced sensitivity to social evaluation events. So when it comes to social evaluation, for example, exam in university, or job performance review, or job interview, so it's social evaluation events, those people are much more sensitive to those events, and thus it results in wider self-esteem variability. Those people also have increased concern about their self-view, so they're much more critical towards themselves, and they're concerned about themselves and being like good people in broad sense. They overly reliant on social sources of evaluation. So basically, they trust other people's opinions more than they rely on their own opinion, which obviously makes their self-esteem more vulnerable and causes more variability. And finally, they react to evaluation often with anger and hostility. And again, it's understandable, because if you're so sensitive to social evaluations and your self-esteem depends on that so heavily, obviously it causes anxiety and anger and hostility, because all people basically wish to have firm, high self-esteem. It's absolutely normal. It is a normal desire. And if something threatens this, having this firm and high or relatively high self-esteem, it might cause anger and hostility as well as anxiety, right? Which is also, in my opinion, quite understandable. So, final social component of the self is called social identity. So descriptive component is self-concept, evaluative component is self-esteem, and final component, which we will discuss in this video, is so-called social identity. Social identity is a part of self-concept that is derived from membership in social groups and categories ranging from family to nationality or race. So actually, we are members of many, many, many social groups. It can be people whom you personally know, obviously, for example, your family, but it also might be very broad groups of people, for example, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans. You can identify yourself with your ethnicity, nationality, race, sexual orientation, gender, religion, age group, socioeconomic status, like I'm a middle class person or an upper middle class person or a lower middle class person, and so on, right? So you're actually a member of many, many groups, but membership in those groups is not equally important. So not all memberships actually result in forming independent dimension in your self-concept. So membership in some groups is much more important for you and becomes part of your self-concept and social identity. And membership in other groups do not become part of your identity. For example, even if you use like public transport, it doesn't necessarily result in forming identity. I'm a public transport user, right? For some people, it's actually important because, for example, of environmental views and values, right? So they use only public transport because it's good for environment, right? It's their core value, and they identify themselves as a public transport users. Vast majority of people, it just like they never think about themselves in those categories, right? So membership in different groups is not equally important. Social identity has two main features. First, continuity. People can count on you to be the same as person tomorrow as you are today. So basically, when you say, I am conservative, liberal, middle class, public transport user, black, white, Asian, and so on, people imply that you will be the same tomorrow, so they can rely on you as a member of their group, right? So people usually do not change their identity and social identity overnight. So we usually count that other people we know who are members of our group will continue to be members of our group tomorrow. And in this sense, social identity implies continuity, but also it implies contrast. So it means that you differentiate yourself from people from other groups, right? So when you say I am liberal, it means that you're not conservative or NDP supporter. When you say, for example, I don't know, I'm middle class person, it implies that you're not upper class person and not lower class person, right? So it differentiates you from other people and help to form like us and they feeling. So us, people who belong to my group, and they, people who do not, people of other groups, right? With different biases, right? So it might be connected with in-group favoritism and out-group aggression, which is typical for people, but not necessary, right? So social identity helps us to maintain continuity and contrast. Both aspects are important. So we already know Erik Erikson and his works on developmental psychology. And he is also famous for because he coined the term identity, actually. And he described identity crises quite well. So identity crisis is a phase of life marked by experimentation, changing, conflicting, or newly emerging values, and a lack of commitment to one's usual roles in society. So identity crisis is a time of change in your life when you stop identify yourself in terms of your previous social roles, but you not necessarily formed new social roles. For example, you graduate from university and you stop being university student, but who you are after that, right? So for some people, it creates some sort of small identity crisis. Who am I now? Like how I identify myself. Identity crisis is very typical for teenagers. It's a huge part of being adolescent. And of course, it happens time after time with like adult people. For example, people who immigrated to a new country might experience identity crisis because all their social roles changing, right? How they should identify themselves. It might happen due to different life circumstances, for example, getting married or divorced and so on. So it might be connected with positive events, with negative events more often. So, and it's not a pleasant experience. So on internal level, we usually perceive it as something stressful and effortful. So normative identity crisis happens in adolescence and middle age, but not necessarily only in those ages. Actually, there could be many other identity crises through your lifespan, but they not necessarily would be the major identity crisis. So psychologist Roy Baumeister suggests that basically there are two types of identity crises if we will try to classify them. The first one is identity deficit. Arises when a person has not formed an adequate identity and basically has trouble making major decisions. Like, who am I? I don't know, right? So identity deficit often occurs when a person discards old values and goals, but doesn't necessarily have new values and goals. Basically, people with identity deficit have a problem in answering the question, who am I? So identity conflict is a different type of identity crisis. It involves incompatibility between two or more aspects of identity. So they contradict each other and you need to make a choice. This type of crisis often occurs when a person is forced to make an important and difficult life decision. Identity conflicts usually involve intense feelings of guilt and remorse and perceived unfaithfulness to an important aspects of person identity. For a small example of really, really small identity conflict, for example, you have a shift at work at the same time when you have classes at university. You cannot attend both places at the same time, and you need to choose. Are you a university student today, or are you an employer today, right? You need to make a choice. If you go to your job place, you fail at attending class, which might result in negative consequences. If you attend the class, you fail to attend your job shift, right, work shift, and you fail as an employee. Unpleasant conflict, sometimes we need to choose, right? It can be bigger, right, when you find that your previous values contradict membership in certain social groups, or your religious beliefs got in conflict with your economic activities and beliefs, and you need to choose something one. So it can create different types of conflicts, which also is unpleasant to experience. But eventually people always find a way out. So resolution of identity crisis usually looks as represented on the slide. So people forced to decide which values are more important, right? Is it more important for me to work, or is it more important for me to study, for example, right? After that, we transform these abstract values into desires and actual behavior. So once we made a choice, we start acting, and it helps identity crisis resolution. The problem is that actually to decide which values are more important sometimes can be incredibly hard, because you might find two things equally important for you, and it's really hard to make a choice which is actually more important and which is less important, because you perceive them as equals. So this is what actually creates a conflict. But once you made a choice and you transform it in certain behavior, it eventually leads to resolution of identity crisis. So conclusion for this lecture on self, right? What we have learned. So first, in general, cognitive experiential domain emphasizes an understanding of people's perceptions, thought, feelings, and desires, and other conscious experiences. The focus here is to understand those experiences, especially from person's point of view. So we focus on internal experiences. People differ from each other in terms of their perception, interpretation of events, goals, intelligence levels, and actually emotions and self-concepts. People differ from each other in terms of emotion and emotional styles, and people differ from each other in experience of their self. These experiences are unique, right? So our self is absolutely unique and differ from self of other people. And basically, you can focus on different aspects of yourself. Thank you for your attention. In this lecture, we finished discussing cognitive experiential domain. In the next lectures, we will transit to social and cultural domain, one of the key domains in personality psychology. So see you next video. Thank you for your attention. Once again, goodbye.